Art rock is a stylistic era whose genesis or first influence came with the release of the Sgt. Pepper's album by the Beatles in 1967. Soon after the release of this album, which in many people's minds was the establishment of rock and roll as an art music, other artists and recording companies felt that it was time to start experimenting with their own output. The music of art rock was generally defined with four different identifications or definitions. The first was that the music was highly experimental. The second was that art rock quite often had higher pretensions than mainstream rock and roll. This generally meant that the musicians, the audience, and the authorities that analyzed this kind of rock and roll felt that it was more substantial or thoughtful than mainstream rock and roll. A third identification or definition for art rock was that quite often it borrowed elements and characteristics from the classical tradition of music, Western art music. And finally, art rock could indeed borrow characteristics and elements from non Western music, such as African, Chinese, even Native American music. Various performances of art rock could have any one or several of these characteristics or identifications present. Unlike the author of your textbook, we will approach art rock as an umbrella term that umbrellas three substantial streams or perspectives in art rock. The first is the center stream, which is art rock itself, which takes several of the identifications that we just mentioned, but in particular borrows quite often from the classical tradition. The second stream that we'll talk about briefly is eclectic rock, which is a rather radical version of art rock, which does a lot of experimentation and perhaps borrows from other elements of music as well. The third stream that we'll talk about briefly is progressive rock, which is a much more conservative version of art rock, and in fact is much more like mainstream rock and roll than either of the other two streams. The center stream of art rock, or the classical side of art rock, actually got started with the Sgt. Pepper's album and perhaps even earlier albums by the Beatles when they were borrowing from the classical tradition for the instrumentation in particular and some of the forms and structures they used in their music prior to Sgt. Pepper's. Groups that became art rock groups down this center stream were groups like the Moody Blues, Procol Harum through their particular tune called A Whiter Shade of Pale, which borrowed from Johann Sebastian Bach. There were other groups such as Genesis, Roxy Music, Renaissance, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and others. Eclectic rock has a particular philosophy that most of its musicians follow that espouse this type of music. It is a music that is much more popular in England and continental Europe than it is in the United States States being somewhat a more conservative consciousness as far as its musical taste is concerned. It is, however, two musicians from the United States that basically populate eclectic rock better than any other examples that we could give. The first is a guy by the name of Don Van Vliet, who was also known as Captain Beefheart. Captain Beefheart did blues with an electronic bent, sometimes avant-garde, rhyme schemes with no rhyme, as well as relatively fast tempos. But the real center of eclectic rock is a guy by the name of Frank Zappa, who got started with his Mothers of Invention band back in 1966. The philosophy of the eclectic is to be totally unique, totally unusual with each bit of output that you do. Every song should sound completely different from every other tune that you do. In fact, to the point that the band doesn't even sound like the same band on each song. This resulting inconsistency of style also brings up the other tenet of eclectic rock. If a tune that you do ever becomes popular, then you have failed at your task. The third stream of art rock, which is progressive rock, is populated by bands such as Yes, Kansas, Rush, Boston, Styx, and others who generally do music that's much more like mainstream rock with some form of experimentation in the music, such as the violin player that populated the instrumentation of Kansas. Some bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer did some music that can be considered art rock down the center stream, some eclectic music, such as the music from their Brain Salad Surgery album, as well as music that might be considered more mainstream or more progressive. Jazz rock or fusion is a stylistic era that actually results from the combination of characteristics from rock and roll and jazz being combined or homogenized together. Unlike our author or other authors, I tend to believe that jazz rock and fusion are actually slightly different types of music. Jazz rock is the stylistic bent when the music easily shows the different characteristics of rock and roll and jazz as they combine together. Fusion music, on the other hand, is a music that's relatively new sounding when those characteristics of rock and roll or jazz combine in such a way that they're not easily discernible but form a brand new approach. Jazz rock typically has its genesis with a particular activity, which was that of jazz musicians, particularly during the mid-1960s, reaching over into the world of rock and roll and borrowing elements of rock and roll to influence their own music. Musicians who could be included in this particular activity would be Herbie Hancock, Miles Davis, Billy Cobham, Gary Burton, the band The Fourth Way, and others. In the later 60s, there were a few bands who tended to try to create a more commercial form of their jazz rock music, or jazz rock that was simply more influenced by the rock and roll styles. Some of these bands became known as Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Chicago Transit Authority, or Chicago for short, as well as the Electric Flag and Ten Wheel Drive. One of the most significant elements for these jazz rock groups that were somewhat more commercial in the late 1960s, early 1970s, was the use of the brass section. The brass section was used in a very different way than it had been in Motown and soul music, where it had essentially been used to replace the background vocalists in the call and response with the lead vocalist. In jazz rock, and in fusion for that matter, the brass section was used to replace the vocalist altogether, so that the brass section performed all of the melodic, harmonic interest for a certain period of time in the music. The fusion style of music began in the early to mid-1970s with one particular group especially, that was the seminal group Weather Report, with leaders Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter. This group spawned several other types of more commercial versions of fusion music, particularly through the groups by a couple of other jazz musicians, Chick Corea with his Return to Forever band, as well as Herbie Hancock's The Headhunters group. There were a few other more commercial versions as well, called Spyro Gyra, as well as some of the music of Steely Dan. Obviously, in jazz rock and in fusion music, improvisation is much more important than it is in normal rock and roll. In mainstream rock and roll throughout the ages, there were only just a couple of stylistic eras which used improvisation to any extent, perhaps some of the blues styles, rhythm and blues and others, as well as the psychedelic rock of the mid-1960s. The improvisation used in these styles was not nearly as highly structured as the music used in jazz rock and also in fusion. The significance of jazz rock was also shown through the competent musicians who began to make contributions to rock technique. Rock did indeed become much more complicated as a result of the characteristics added by jazz, and the commercial value of rock was made somewhat broader by the inclusion of an audience that previously would have shunned it. At times, the message of the lyrics was stated better because of the expanded support mechanism, and many electronic devices became more commonplace in both jazz and rock. Studio musicians began to set the standard for musical development as the media started to demand more of this type of music, and the jazz influences began further to legitimize rock as a serious form of communication and as art.